around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. In the year 1974, the front door slammed shut and school bags were already being thrown onto the floor. In the living room, the fake wood television was still playing colorful snack commercials. The crunching sounds louder and crispier than real life, cartoon mascots laughing, as if every child in America came home from school to bags overflowing with treats. But on the other side of the house, inside the small kitchen of a working-class family, a mother stood staring at the nearly scraped clean bottom of a yellow margarine tub, a loaf of white bread already more than half gone, and a sleeve of crackers that had been opened several days earlier. That was where the real snacks truly began, when the recipe box was opened after school. Tonight, the old recipe box is sitting once again on top of a formica table scratched by years of hot pots and cold glasses of milk. The dark brown wooden box opens slowly, revealing index cards with curled edges, faded pencil handwriting, and tiny grease stains resting permanently in the corners as though nobody had bothered trying to wipe them away anymore. One card reads, bread, margarine, sugar. Another says, crackers and syrup. One card carries a smear of grease beside the words, fried bologna. Farther back sits a tiny slip of paper containing only 3 words, popcorn, stove, bowl. Those cards once lived in kitchens where paychecks had not yet arrived by the end of the week. In the year 1973, a loaf of white bread in many places cost only around 30 cents. A package of bologna was far cheaper than fresh meat, and a bag of popcorn kernels could fill several bowls for all the children in the house. That is why snacks in those years often began with a very real question. What do we still have left to eat? The 25 foods in this video were born inside kitchens that knew how to stretch every slice of bread, every spoonful of sugar, and every inexpensive canned item into a few more hours of fullness for children after school. They were simple foods that helped a house feel a little less empty before supper finally reached the table. When a little sugar was enough to make a child feel retard. Around 4:30 in the afternoon in the year 1973, snack commercials still echoed from the television sitting in the living room. Brightly colored, crunchy treats filled the screen with loud laughter and cheerful music, as though every household in America had cabinets overflowing with sweet snacks. But inside many old working-class kitchens, a mother stood in front of a nearly empty cupboard, holding a loaf of white bread already flattened at the bottom of the bag, trying to decide what she could make to keep the children who had just returned from school from feeling hungry for a few more hours before supper. And, on many afternoons, the real answer was simply margarine, a little sugar, and a slice of bread. The recipe cards in this section were the thinnest ones inside the old recipe box. Their edges had softened from years of greasy fingers and time. One card said only, bread, margarine, sugar. Another read, crackers, syrup. A different scrap of paper still carried smaller words written in the lower corner, brown sugar if there is any. Only a few short lines, yet enough to say a great deal about a kitchen that always had to think carefully before opening anything else in the cupboard. The first card led to sugar bread, something that appeared in working-class neighborhoods throughout Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania during the early 1970s. A slice of white bread costing only a few cents was placed on a plate. Margarine was spread so thinly that the soft bread beneath could still be seen through it. Then white sugar was sprinkled lightly across the top, just enough for the tongue to taste sweetness with the first bite. Children ate quickly because the sugar easily fell onto the table, but for many of them, that tiny sweetness alone was enough to make the long afternoon after school feel a little shorter. Then came crackers with syrup, a snack that was messier and more fun. A few saltine crackers were laid across a paper towel, while inexpensive corn syrup slowly dripped through the tiny holes on their surface. The snack scattered cracker crumbs all across the table, and usually forced mothers to warn children not to dirty the sofa, yet they still made it because children loved the feeling of eating something that resembled a real dessert. Finally, there was bread with butter and brown sugar, a snack carrying a warmer smell than the kitchen usually held. Brown sugar during those years was often saved for baking or special occasions, so simply watching a mother break apart a few hardened clumps and sprinkle them across bread was enough to make a child feel that the day was somehow different from ordinary days. In those homes, snacks were never created to become trends. They were made to keep children full for a few more hours and to make them feel cared for, even during weeks when the paycheck had still not arrived. When fat was not about luxury, but about staying full. There were afternoons in the year 1973 when the kitchen had almost nothing left to pull out. Snack commercials on televisions still showed thick layers of cheese and cheerful crunching sounds, but inside many old working-class homes, mothers opened the refrigerator very slowly to see what remained. That was soft enough, rich enough, and quick enough for the children who had just returned from school. A jar of mayonnaise was nearly scraped clean at the bottom, a little butter still clinging to its wrapper. A few crackers are left at the end of the sleeve. Half a loaf of bread is already drying around the edges. Those things sounded so small that outsiders could easily overlook them. Yet inside kitchens that lived from paycheck to paycheck, they were what kept children going until supper. The recipe cards in this section felt as though they had spent years sitting beside the stove. One card read, "Mayo bread." Another simply said, "Old bread in milk." The lower corner of the card, labeled "butter cracker," still carried a faded smear of butter like the print of an old fingerprint. These were the kinds of foods adults no longer needed recipes to prepare, but they remembered them clearly because every dish was tied to periods when grocery money had to stretch for several more days. The first card led to mayonnaise sandwiches. 2 slices of white bread were taken from the end of the bag, slightly flattened at the corners. The mother opened the mayonnaise jar and spread an extremely thin layer across the bread. Some households added a little salt and pepper, if any remained. Others pressed the slices together and cut them in half so the sandwich would appear more substantial. Many adults later felt embarrassed to speak about that meal because it revealed too clearly how little the household once had. But during afternoons when mothers had not yet returned from work and meat needed to be saved for supper, a sandwich with something soft and rich inside still made a child feel cared for. Then came bread with milk, a quiet meal from homes that refused to waste anything still usable. Stale bread was torn into a bowl while cold milk was slowly poured over it until the bread softened again. Some families added a little sugar. Others sprinkled in a pinch of salt. The dish did not feel cheerful like the snacks shown in television commercials. It felt gentler, slower, and carried the exhaustion of days when every item in the kitchen had to be carefully saved. Finally, there were crackers with butter, a tiny snack children somehow remembered for years afterward. The sound of the cracker sleeve opening echoed through the quiet kitchen. A knife scraped butter into a layer so thin it almost disappeared into the surface of the crackers. The mother arranged a few crackers carefully on a small plate and placed them before her child, as though they were still something thoughtfully prepared. In many homes during those years, fat was never a luxury meant to impress anyone. It was simply what kept bread from feeling too dry, crackers from sticking in the throat, and children from feeling hungry again before supper arrived. When the pantry became the last hope before payday. There were evenings near the end of the month in the year 1974 when the kitchen felt quieter than usual. The mother opened the pantry door very slowly, almost as though staring longer at the shelves might somehow cause more food to appear inside. The kitchen light reflected against small tin cans pushed toward the back, their paper labels already faded from sitting there too long. A can of Vienna sausages, a can of deviled ham, a small tin of sandwich spread is barely enough for a few crackers. For many working-class families during those years, the feeling of security sometimes came from one very small sound: the pop of a can opening inside a kitchen running dangerously low on food. The recipe cards in this section of the old recipe box carried a different feeling from the earlier chapters. They seemed as though they had spent years sitting beside canned goods, beside metal can openers, and beside afternoons when adults had to calculate carefully what could be used today while still saving enough for tomorrow. One card read, "Vienna sausages, crackers." Another simply said, "Spread thin." At the bottom of another card, a sentence had been underlined heavily. "Save the rest." That line alone captured almost the entire spirit of the old working-class kitchen. Everything had to last a little longer. The first food was Vienna sausages eaten straight from the can. When the metal lid finally popped open, small sausages appeared resting inside, pale and salty. The mother poured away some of the liquid before placing the sausages carefully onto a plate. If there were crackers left in the house, she added a few beside them. If not, children simply picked them up and ate them with their hands. One small can often had to be divided between 2 or 3 children, only a few pieces each, before it was gone. To adults, it was merely an ordinary canned product. To children, it meant the house still had something left to eat that day. Then came canned meat spread on crackers, something that made a few saltine crackers feel more like a real meal. The mother used a knife to scoop the soft meat from the can and spread an extremely thin layer across each cracker. Thin mattered. A thicker layer meant the can would disappear too quickly. In those kitchens, adults always understood how to transform very little into the feeling of having enough for everyone. Finally, there was deviled ham, carrying a strong, meaty smell and a faint spicy sharpness that spread through the kitchen almost immediately after opening the lid. The mother scraped carefully along the edges of the can so that nothing would be wasted before spreading it onto bread or crackers. A tiny can like that never made anyone feel wealthy, but it helped the kitchen feel a little less empty before payday arrived, and many times the feeling of safety inside a working-class home rested in those very small tin cans hidden deep inside the pantry shelves. When 60 to 90 seconds could turn cheap food into something children waited for. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, inside a working-class kitchen during the summer of 1974, a small table fan slowly turned in the corner of the room, pushing the heat around instead of truly cooling the house. Then suddenly, the sound of a skillet cut through the air. A slice of bologna touched the hot cast iron and immediately began to hiss. The smell of salty meat spread quickly through the small kitchen, quickly enough that the children lying in front of the television lifted their heads almost at the same moment. That was the special thing about hot snacks during those years. They never needed expensive ingredients to make an entire house pay attention. They only needed heat. The recipe cards in this section of the old recipe box carried more traces of the kitchen than the earlier chapters. The corners of the paper were stained with old grease. Some lines of handwriting had blurred slightly, as though the person writing them had still been holding a kitchen towel while quickly scribbling them down. Slice thin. 1 minute. Those short instructions sounded exactly like the way adults passed recipes to one another inside cramped kitchens where nobody had time to write anything longer. The first food was fried bologna, something that appeared in countless working-class kitchens across the Midwest during the early 1970s. The moment a slice of bologna hit the hot skillet, the edges immediately began curling upward. The center puffed slightly while the outer rim slowly darkened, and the smell of browning meat made the kitchen feel as though a real meal was being cooked. A pound of bologna during those years cost far less than ham or roast beef. So many families sliced it very thin to make it last longer. But for children, simply holding a piece of meat fresh from the skillet felt completely different from eating cold slices straight from the refrigerator. Then came fried Spam, carrying a stronger smell and a heavier feeling in the stomach. The mother opened the can, slid a knife carefully around the edges to loosen the block of meat, and then sliced it into thin pieces. Thin mattered enormously in a kitchen built around stretching food. Thick slices meant the can would disappear too quickly. Thin slices fried crisp made the entire can seem larger. When the surface of the meat began turning brown and the outer edges crisped slightly, the salt, rich smell spread through the room like an inexpensive version of bacon. Finally, there were Ritz crackers with Velveeta, a snack taking barely a minute, yet still capable of making children stand, waiting directly in front of the toaster oven. One round cracker, one small square of yellow cheese placed on top, then into the heat. Adults had to watch carefully because even a few extra seconds would soften the cracker too much and melt the cheese beyond saving. But when removed at exactly the right moment, the slightly softened Velveeta transformed a few ordinary Ritz crackers into something that felt specially prepared for someone. In poor kitchens during those years, heat carried a strange kind of power. It made inexpensive food feel less cold and empty, gave the kitchen the smell of a real meal, and made children feel as though the afternoon held something worth looking forward to. Memories of the South, Appalachia, and working-class kitchens. By the middle of the video, the recipe box begins to feel less like a collection of snacks and more like an old map. As the pantry historian flips to the next group of recipe cards, it almost feels as though the entire working-class America of the 1970s is unfolding inside that small kitchen. The South appears through the smell of cold cornbread and chilled milk. Appalachia appears through foods recreated from the leftovers of the previous night's supper. Oklahoma and Arkansas appear through the sharp sizzling sound of hot oil when handfuls of batter are dropped into a skillet. Every region carried its own version of hardship, and every region also found its own way to keep children from going to bed with stomachs that felt too empty. The recipe cards in this section carry a feeling completely different from the earlier chapters. One corner still has dry cornbread crumbs stuck to the paper. Another card carries a faint smear of mayonnaise beside the word tomato. One tiny scrap of paper contains only 3 short words: flour, water, fry. Those lines sound less like recipes and more like the memories of entire regions. The first food is crumbled cornbread with cold milk, something that appeared in countless Southern kitchens during the summer of 1973. Leftover cornbread from the previous evening was broken into pieces inside a glass or bowl, then cold milk was poured over it until the bread slowly softened. Some families added sugar. Others sprinkled a little salt. Some left it exactly as it was. In kitchens so hot that table fans merely pushed warm air around the room, this dish seemed to cool the entire afternoon rather than simply fill an empty stomach. It carried the unmistakable feeling of the Old South, where leftovers from yesterday's supper continued living into the next day. Then came the tomato sandwich, a food carrying brighter colors than many of the other poor meals in the video. A tomato freshly picked from the backyard garden was sliced thick and placed onto white bread, spread with a thin layer of mayonnaise. Salt and pepper were sprinkled lightly across the soft red slices. Tomato juice slowly soaked into the bread, making the sandwich slightly wet in the center, in exactly the way many people still remember decades later. This was a summer food, a meal for weeks when cash was running low, but the garden continued producing something edible. Finally, there was poor man's fried dough, a food born from one of the oldest questions in working-class kitchens. Do we have a little flour left? Flour was mixed with water and a little salt, then pinched into small pieces and dropped into hot oil. The sizzling sound came almost immediately. The edges of the dough slowly turned golden, while the smell of hot fried batter spread through the kitchen, drawing children closer to the stove. A small handful of flour never seemed like much, yet inside poor kitchens throughout the South and Appalachia, it could still become a few real moments of happiness for children after school. After school, when Mom was not home yet, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, inside a working-class house near the end of the 1970s, the sound of a key turning in the front door lasted only a second before the house fell quiet again. School bags were dropped beside the sofa. The television in the living room still played familiar cartoon programs. Outside the windows, the late afternoon sun remained harsh and bright. But nobody stood cooking in the kitchen yet. Mom was still at work. Dad might not return from the evening shift for hours, and during that empty stretch of time, children began figuring out how to fill their stomachs with whatever remained inside the pantry. The recipe cards in this section feel completely different from all the earlier groups. Some of the handwriting tilts awkwardly, looking more like the writing of children than adults. One card says only, "Crush ramen in bag." Another reads, "Peanut butter on anything." Short lines like those sound less like real recipes and more like things passed quietly between brothers and sisters. They tell the story of a time when children slowly learned how to take care of themselves inside houses empty of adults during the afternoon hours. The first food was dry ramen noodles, something that appeared in countless kitchens filled with latchkey kids. The package of noodles was placed on the table and crushed directly inside the bag. The crackling sound of breaking noodles felt mischievous and strangely satisfying. The seasoning packet was torn open, sprinkled inside, and the entire bag shaken hard. Then the children reached inside and ate the salty, crunchy noodles piece by piece like store-bought chips. Some children spent the rest of the afternoon desperately thirsty because they added too much seasoning, yet they still made the snack again the next day. The memorable part of the dish was never the flavor itself. It was the feeling of being able to make something on your own without waiting for anyone to come home. Then there were ants on a log, a snack that felt far more playful than many of the other poor foods in the video. A stalk of celery was filled with peanut butter down the center groove, while raisins were placed on top like tiny ants. Children loved it because they could assemble each part themselves. Some ate the raisins before finishing the snack. Others piled far too many ants onto the celery. Inside homes with little money, turning food into a game sometimes became a way to make childhood feel a little less dry and empty. Finally, there was government peanut butter, far thicker and heavier than the smooth brands shown in television commercials. Adults loved it because it kept people full for a long time. Children remembered it because it could go with almost anything left in the kitchen. Spread onto white bread, smeared across crackers, eaten with soft apple slices, or sometimes eaten directly from the spoon. In many working-class homes during those years, a half-full jar of peanut butter created a very real sense of comfort. It meant that even though Mom had not returned yet and supper was still hours away, the kitchen still held enough food to quiet a child's hunger for a little while longer. When bags of snacks replaced the sound of skillets in the kitchen. By the end of the 1970s, many working-class kitchens still held old cast-iron skillets, peanut butter jars nearly scraped empty, and slices of white bread resting at the bottom of paper bags. But inside the living room, another world had already begun to take over. After-school television played endless streams of brightly colored commercials. The sound of snack bags tearing open felt sharper and more exciting than crackers breaking across a kitchen table. Cartoon mascots danced across glowing television screens brighter than any kitchen inside the house. And for the first time, a child began looking at a slice of sugar bread in their hand with different eyes. At this moment, the pantry historian does not pull another recipe card from the box. Instead, he places the entire stack of old cards down onto the table. Bread, margarine, sugar, mayo, bread, fried bologna, ramen in the bag. The faded pencil writing sits beside the completely different images of a new era. Brightly colored chip bags, snack boxes with prizes hidden inside, advertisements where every child laughed loudly while opening store-bought treats. The distance between those two worlds becomes so obvious that it almost no longer needs explaining. Children watch commercials very differently from adults. Adults saw grocery prices and unpaid bills. Children saw bright colors, cartoon mascots, and the feeling of being like the other kids at school. A new snack inside a lunchbox made a child feel more modern somehow. Meanwhile, a mayonnaise sandwich wrapped inside paper towels slowly began feeling like something to hide as quickly as possible. The old snacks never truly had a fair chance competing in that world. A slice of bread spread with margarine and sugar was too simple to become a major brand. A bowl of cornbread with cold milk felt too regional and too real. A pot of popcorn made on the stove was so inexpensive that almost nobody could build a large business around it. Food companies could sell brightly packaged potato chips and colorful cookies, but it was far more difficult to sell the image of a mother scraping the last layer of butter from a container, just to spread enough across a few slices of bread. And slowly, many of those foods faded deeper into memory. Fried bologna became something adults still remembered the smell of, but rarely talked about anymore. Vienna sausages sat quietly in pantries before disappearing from many younger kitchens altogether. Dry ramen became something children made secretly instead of something remembered openly as part of family life. The disappearance happened slowly, almost silently. There was never one loud moment when everything changed. Life simply became faster, packaging became brighter, and children slowly began believing that real snacks were supposed to come from stores instead of from whatever their mothers still had left inside the kitchen cupboards. Before the recap box is closed again, the pot of popcorn on the stove has slowly cooled down. The popping beneath the metal lid stopped some time ago. In the living room, the television still glows dimly in the corner, while a few unpopped kernels remain scattered across the table beside traces of salt near the large bowl. The smell of hot oil still lingers in the air as though it is not ready to leave yet. The pantry historian sits quietly beside the old kitchen table, resting his hand on the recipe cards whose edges curled throughout the entire video. And the longer he looks at them, the more they resemble the memories of a family rather than cooking instructions. The 25 snacks that have just passed by were never created to impress anyone. They were born from white bread, margarine, mayonnaise, crackers, canned goods, bologna, spam, ramen noodles, peanut butter, cornbread, and bags of popcorn kernels hidden deep inside pantry shelves. Some were made from leftovers from the previous night's supper. Some took only a minute inside the toaster oven. Some began with one very small question: what do we still have left to eat? But every one of them once served the same purpose. Keeping children full for a few more hours before supper finally appeared on the table. The pantry historian begins placing each recipe card back into the old wooden box. Bread, margarine, sugar, mayo bread, cornbread and milk, fried bologna, ramen in the bag. Some cards can barely be read anymore. Some carry grease stains. Some still have grains of dried sugar caught in the corners. Others contain only the name of the dish before stopping abruptly, as though the person writing it had been too busy to explain anything further. Yet somehow those simple cards managed to preserve something Many glossy cookbooks never could. The feeling of a kitchen that truly existed. Today, many people might laugh when they hear about mayonnaise sandwiches, sugar bread, or Vienna sausages eaten straight from the can. From a modern perspective, those foods seem too poor, too simple, and too difficult to place beside brightly packaged modern snacks. But inside old working-class kitchens, nobody made those foods as a joke. Adults made them because children had just come home from school, payday had not arrived yet, and the household still needed to make it through one more afternoon. Perhaps your family had a food like that too. A meal that never appeared in cookbooks, a snack eaten by hand beside the stove or on a paper towel in front of the television. Maybe it was bread with sugar. Maybe it was ramen noodles crushed inside the bag. Maybe it was stovetop popcorn on weekend nights. And often the thing people remember longest is not the food itself. What stays behind much longer is the person who made it for them. The lid of the recipe box closes slowly. The cards return to their old places, but that kitchen has not completely disappeared. It still lives somewhere inside the memories of people who grew up with very little and were still fed with everything their homes were able to give.